Hello, this is Brian Michael. I'm presenting this lesson for agriculture or food history and agriculture 530 with Dr. Cooley. You can see here I've titled this lesson Food Security and America During the New Deal and World War II. And I put together a list of some essential questions I thought would be nice to help guide us through this lesson. First of all, we're going to be looking at some of the positive and negative outcomes of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal as far as it impacted agriculture. And we'll be probably doing that at the end of this presentation. We're also going to take a look at some of the other New Deal programs, such as the Works Progress Administration and how it would impact Americans and American families. Thirdly, I thought we'd take a little time to talk about REA with regard to extending electrical utilities out to the farmers in rural areas. In places like right here in Minnesota, and how did that help American homes and America's small farmers? And then finally we'll take a look at rationing for Americans here at home during World War II, and the what I thought the rather complicated system was as far as having stamps and points assigned to each stamp and different rationing periods, etc. And again, we're back to rationing again because of the fact we've already done it in World War I. So we're maybe a little bit used to it, but I think the rationing for World War II was going to be a bit different than it was for World War I. But the goal is the same. We got to feed our soldiers. Okay. Starting out with some of the main programs of the New Deal when it came to agriculture. First of all, we had the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. That was kind of the umbrella organization that got things rolling. Then we would have the Farm Security Administration later on, and the Farm Credit Administration as well. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration was established to basically try to eliminate surplus goods on the commodities market for farmers. So today, if you think of things like corn and soybeans and maybe wheat, that's pretty common here in the Midwest. The whole point of the program is to take a certain amount of land out of production, thereby keeping the supply side stable, so there's not too much product out there on the market. And in turn, the idea is to keep market prices stable, so farmers can get a fair market price for what they produce. Now, we all know that other things come into play as well, and probably the most important thing that comes into play here is, of course, the weather. I always like to say that farmers are the biggest risk takers out there because they're at the mercy of Mother Nature, for one thing. You never know what's going to happen with the weather. And secondly, it's not a super safe job either. Being a farmer has a lot of dangers. So it's I guess that's one of the reasons that I have a great appreciation for the farming industry. I got a lot of farmers that are friends, and I grew up on a farm. My grandparents were farmers, and before them they were farmers. So yeah, it's a tough living, but it's a very rewarding and satisfying living as well, knowing that you're helping to feed really the entire country, if not the world. So we're trying to eliminate overproduction, and that also included livestock. And early on, of course, you probably read that a lot of livestock and a lot of good crops were destroyed to try to remove it from the market. And it was not used the way it probably should have been, which was to feed the people that needed, especially during the beginnings of the Great Depression. And most would argue that the government took a serious public relations hit when word spread that this kind of thing was happening. As far as down south, agriculture set up a little bit differently. This is still from the remnants of before and after the Civil War. This was almost entrenched into Southern culture. You had your white landlords that owned the land, and then of course you had the tenant farmers, and then you had sharecroppers. And then most were black, African American. Some we call poor whites were mixed in there too. Now the argument is, did these new agricultural policies help or hurt people like tenant farmers and sharecroppers? And I think most people would argue that it probably hurt the sharecroppers and the tenant farmers due to the fact that you're taking land out of production, which means there is less land available for tenant farmers to rent and for sharecroppers to farm. A difference being between a tenant and a sharecropper would be that a tenant leases the land and they have a little bit more control over what they raise, whereas the sharecropper, they neither own or lease the land. They just use it to grow commodities, and then at the end of the growing period, they owe a certain amount of it back to their landlord. So they don't really have a chance to own the land, but it's how they made a living. You take land out of production, that means there's less land for them to farm, and therefore you're essentially eliminating the opportunity for these sharecroppers and tenant farmers to essentially work and have a job and grow and have sustenance for their families. It's also argued that this program probably did more to help the landlords than anybody, due to the fact that the proceeds that they would get from the government to take land out of production would be put into a mechanization for their farms, which would further reduce the need for sharecropper and tenant labor. So that's, I think, something that might get overlooked with regard to the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Did the government set out to do it this way? I think since it was done in haste, they didn't have time to sit down and actually think this thing through to see how it would impact all areas of our population here in the United States. So, did the federal government do enough? Wow, that's hard to say. Again, if we could go back in time and Mr. Roosevelt could tweak a few things, I would imagine that, yeah, this would have been one of the things he probably would have tried to change. Trying to get some of this relief to the farmers without them losing their ability to work. And yeah, maybe a little bit less help for the landowners that probably were not suffering nearly as much as the tenants. Okay. This next slide here shows a couple of political cartoons. Thought were interesting. On the left, you'll see that we have I'm trying to see how it's labeled there. My eyes do not work the best. But essentially, the rather large man with the cane in his hand wants to have the cow killed because they don't want to have to feed it. It's too expensive to feed. And then you have the Supreme Court justice to his right overlooking what he's saying. And then you've got in the milk cans there in the foreground, you have increased farm income, business and industrial gains. Of course, they were another benefactor of some of these government ag programs as well. So I guess the idea behind it is that this program is not doing a lot to help your average yeoman farmer. And then over on the right-hand side, you have, of course, all the different alphabet programs represented by the little children, playing Ring Around the Rosie by the ringleader himself, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they all look rather happy. And, that was, if you remember, that was part of FDR's campaign slogan when he ran for president in 1932. Happy days are here again. So I guess that's partly what this cartoon is trying to represent. Okay. Talk a little bit about the Works Progress Administration. The WPA was a program essentially to provide jobs to people. Okay. If you remember back early when we first learned about the New Deal, the three main goals of the New Deal: relief, recovery, and reform. Okay, relief would have been, try to put some money in these people's pockets and some food on their tables to at least stabilize things at home. Recovery, now that's going to include getting these people to work. Okay, yes, we want them to have food on their table, but we should get something out of it as long as the government is kicking in and footing the bill for a lot of this relief. And that's what the Works Progress Administration did, created jobs to, if you look at the picture here, it looks like they're building a sidewalk in, it doesn't say which town, but if you were to go around any small to medium-sized town here in Minnesota today, chances are good that if you walk down a sidewalk, you would see a little stamp in the concrete, and it would say WPA, and then it would say the year that the project was completed. And yes, in my hometown, they still have these sidewalks. They're not in the best of shape, but they're still there. So obviously the people that built the sidewalks knew what they were doing, that's for sure. They also built public buildings. A lot of community buildings in smaller towns, community centers, may have been built by the WPA. Hospitals, libraries, courthouses, things like that could have been WPA projects. Unfortunately, a lot of these jobs were temporary, and the men would struggle to come up with enough money to feed their families. They would send home whatever they could, and a lot of times they'd end up going somewhere else around the country to start a different job, because they kind of had to follow where the work was being performed. So, and then of course we got to think about the kids too. School lunch program is going to be what I would consider to be one of the big successes out of the New Deal. We're going to come up with not only a way to use up all of the surplus without having to destroy it, take it out of the market, we're going to put it to good use, and we will find out that it's not going to have a huge impact on market prices and on the supply side, because it will get used up, especially during the Depression and World War II. Okay. So we move ahead here to what I think is probably one of the most underrated elements of the Great Depression, and that would be the REA co-ops. Okay? The legislation to create this agency started in 1935, and the main focus was to bring electricity out to the rural areas. Because up to this point, according to my documents, I want to say 90% of small farms out in the country had no electricity. So you can imagine how labor-intensive things had to be. Having been a farmer, I know that having to haul water in 5-gallon buckets to make sure the livestock have sufficient water, especially in the hot summers, is extremely labor-intensive. Not to mention having to deliver feed the same way. And then at night, I mean, you can't, it's hard to see, so now we're looking at having kerosene lamps in the barn and in the home, and realize that when things got hot and dry, these farm homes and barns were like tinder boxes, and any stray spark, things could go up in flames in a hurry. So not only are we starting to make life a little bit easier labor-wise for the farmer, we're also making things much safer as well. And speaking of making life a little bit easier, we have a picture here of a lady in a kitchen, typical farm kitchen, with an electric stove instead of a wood-burning stove like you probably would have bought from Sears back in the late 1800s. Instead of having to light a fire in the firebox, this time you would simply plug it in, and there you go. You had instant heat, and it was also safe as well. Not that electricity isn't without its dangers, but I can imagine it would be a heck of a lot safer than you're having to burn wood and kerosene in the home. So. And then you can also see evidence of electricity, the fact that they've got a light here, and they've got, of course, a refrigerator, and then looks like they have a clock on the wall as well. That's probably run with electricity. So, and Minnesota is a good example of the REA and its success because, to my knowledge, I think we have over 80 REA co-ops here in Minnesota, and again, without them, farmers don't have that ability to light up their farms with a flick of a switch, or dry their grain after a harvest, or just simply dairy farmers have to have refrigeration to keep the milk cool. All that stuff takes electricity, and those are some pretty important elements that the REA brings to the farmer. And not only that, but whenever there's a storm and the power goes out, these REA co-ops are there to fix the outages and get people taken care of as soon as possible. So I guess we can safely say that the REA definitely helped out farmers as far as perhaps being more productive because of the less labor-intensive activities that had to be performed. So they could get more done quicker, maybe more even produced, okay? And that lent itself to helping supply our country with sufficient food. Okay, next slide. World War II rationing, American families and American soldiers. Okay, well, it's going to be the families that are doing the rationing, and the benefactor, of course, is going to be the American soldier overseas. And during the height of World War II, I mean, there were we were essentially fighting. It was a true world war. We were fighting in 4 theaters of operation. First of all, we were in Europe, and then we were in the Pacific Theater of Operations after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and then we were in the North Africa campaign, and following that, we spent some time in Italy. So, yeah, we were spread pretty thin with regard to troops and equipment and food. And it was up to the government to put programs in place to make sure that not only were our soldiers sufficiently supplied with food, but also our allies. We're talking about our allies from Great Britain, France, Russia, even China, to just name a few. And luckily we came up with, the technology allowed us to come up with some pretty innovative ways to can and preserve food that had a indefinite shelf life that could be used in these situations. The rationing point system, I guess if I were living back then, I would have gotten frustrated with it because it seems a little bit complicated. But I guess once I started doing it, I would probably get used to it. So certain foods would cost a certain amount of points. And also, in addition to that, certain foods could only be purchased with certain colored stamps. And those colors and the amount of points needed would change every, how did they phrase it? Every period, okay? So these point values would change from time to time, and it was up to the grocer, to keep track of all this stuff. So now the grocery store owner, he had a tough job to make sure, his store was sufficiently supplied, and he was charging enough for each item that was going out the door. Similar to what we had during World War I, it was the idea of victory gardens was also pushed, where American families were encouraged to grow food on their property rather than buying it. If you live in town, of course, that can only go so far, but that was one way. If you were loyal to the war effort, you could help out, along with using the rationing point system. Now this next slide I have is something you probably would have seen in a grocery store, perhaps, anywhere in the country. It says how to shop with War Ration Book 2. Okay, so this is from period 2. And it shows you the items that you can use, the items that you can purchase, and then it shows you which stamps that you want to use and how many stamps you want to use, because they do come in different denominations. And again, down here it talks about, like, for instance, this lady's buying a can of tomatoes costing 8 points. Then there are some items that were not rationed, and then of course you had ceiling prices, where prices could not go above a certain amount to keep control of the market, I guess, so people during wartime aren't getting priced out of the market, and inflation doesn't run rampant and things of that nature. We've seen that happen in previous wars, like, for instance, the Civil War, where without some kind of a rationing system in place, prices just spiral completely out of control. And that was especially true in the Civil War South, and the post-Civil War South, for that matter. Okay. Oh, We cannot leave rationing without talking about one of my favorites, spam. Now, whenever I bring up spam to my students, they always, they usually don't have a real positive reaction to spam. But for some reason, I enjoy it. Anyway, spam played kind of a big role in the war in that, first of all, it's non-perishable, it's got a good shelf life, it's transferable, and we started sending cans of spam to our allies overseas. And it especially caught on over in first Hawaii and then the Philippines, because apparently, well, first of all, I'm not too familiar with Hawaiian cuisine, but apparently spam meshes well with the Hawaiian diet, with some of the different things they have. It's got kind of a salty, savory flavor to it, although some people have trouble with the consistency, the texture. But yeah, spam played a decent role in helping feed our soldiers overseas, and it kind of represents steadfastness and stick-to-itiveness, something that our soldiers would need in combat. So, and spam is manufactured right here, and the headquarters is here in good old Austin, Minnesota. So, chalk one up for spam. Okay, now I'd like to finish off today talking about some of the positives and negatives of the New Deal with regard to how it impacted agriculture and food supply. First, let's start with the positives. I think we can all agree that the school lunch program being created was a big positive. Me being a teacher, I can attest that students learn better and perform better in school when they are properly fed. And the school lunch program allows students to get a reasonably priced meal every day. In some states, like Minnesota now, those school lunches are completely paid at 100%. Other states, they are heavily subsidized by the federal government. And if there was no subsidy from the government, if there was no USDA surplus to give to the schools, then I would imagine the price of a meal for a student would probably be, in today's world, I don't know, around $10 a piece. So I think that the school lunch program is a definite A+ as far as relieving the financial burden on families, especially families that, struggle month to month, check to check. We're putting farm commodities to use instead of leaving them to waste. Okay, this idea of removing them completely from the market by destroying them, boy, that's a tough thing to do, especially if you're a farmer and you put up all that work into raising a crop and raising livestock. So luckily now we got programs in place to make use of these surplus commodities. We have after the during the later 30s and into the 40s, we had government setting up tenant purchase programs where tenants could actually have a shot at buying land and getting into a decent house that was livable, not an old log home like you see in some of your history books that are virtually unlivable. The agriculture, the AAA, attempted to reduce surpluses by increasing prices of the commodities, which I think did happen, but originally the way they did it was probably not the way people had hoped with regard to destroying commodities. But the whole point was to try to stabilize the market, to make sure that the price of these commodities did not fall completely off the table. And that's kind of what was happening throughout the 1920s. So if you study what are known as the sick industries, one of them was agriculture, because farmers were, they were going through tough times. They had increased the amount of land they put in production for war purposes. And they did enjoy good prices during the war. However, once the war was over, all of the government programs went away, and they kept producing at a wartime level, and I think you can see what will happen there. You have increased supply, and you have a decreased commodities prices, and that was especially tough on the farmers. And then, of course, the FSA getting hold of the soil problem here in the United States. Farmers were taught to take care of the soil. Don't overplant, rotate crops, conservation tillage, contour plowing, anything to help eliminate erosion, and in drought conditions keep the soil from being swept up by the wind. And these are all key elements that I think really went a long way to helping agriculture and food production. Some of the negative outcomes. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, the AAA forced southern sharecroppers and tenants off the land due to a reduction in acres planted. A lot of them would end up going north to try to find jobs up there, and some of them did find success in getting jobs up there. I believe they called, in the 1920s, they called it the Great Migration. Okay. And of course, blacks would bring their cooking and cuisine with them up north. And in fact, there are still restaurants today that serve what many people would consider to be soul food. Farmers destroying the excess produce, that was a tough pill to swallow for people, because of the fact that all that surplus could be used to save, help people in very difficult times, people that were food insufficient. And eventually we figured out that we need to change the way we handle that situation. The AAA program created wealthier farmers, okay, at the detriment to the poorer farmers, the tenants and the sharecroppers. Some of these proceeds from the program were put into mechanization, and that would eliminate even more jobs. And finally, the WPA created jobs, but a lot of this work was seasonal, which put the pinch on people to come up with enough money to feed their families. So as far as the positives and negatives of the New Deal with regard to agriculture and food security, boy, I mean, it depends upon, I guess, where you stand politically. The government had to step in and do something to help feed people. And the thing was that at least Mr. Roosevelt was given credit for doing something, whereas a lot of people argue that Herbert Hoover wasn't really doing much to help solve this problem. So something had to be done. It did get done, although it did start a big trend in deficit spending in our country that we still struggle with today. And some people would argue that we're moving closer and closer to socialism, and the New Deal is where it started. I don't know. Those are all things that are debatable, and they can figure that out in the next presidential campaign, I guess. So, but yeah, farmers, without farmers, I always tell my students, without farmers, we all die, because where are we going to get our food? So, unless we all become hunter-gatherers or something. So, I have incredible respect for farmers, and I think Mr. Roosevelt did too, and in some of these programs that he and Congress came up with. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will get this off to you, Dr. Cooley, as soon as I can. Have a great day.